Welcome. Here is attempt number 2 on this recording. It's about the critical period, the 1780s. Just a quick word about the term the critical period. The word critical can mean like criticizing somebody, but when we talk about the 1780s, we don't really mean it in that sense. We mean it more of as in the really important period. Like you can talk about adolescence as the critical period in a person's development when they kind of figure out who they are. And so what went on in the 1780s is pivotal in determining what form of government the U.S. is going to take. So that's the meaning of that. Sorry, I just answered that. The focus of this whole unit is going to be on the Constitution as it was written and ratified, and then the practices of our government. But we didn't start with the Constitution, as you read about. We started with first declaring our independence, and then using the Articles of Confederation in 1781, and then Shays' Rebellion occurred in 1786. And those things shape the eventual Constitution we end up with. So our focus today, or this lecture, is going to be on these things in the early 1780s. This is a pretty important slide. I'm going to list all the kinds of things you need to think about and understand when you're done with the lecture. First, need to be clear about our initial attitudes at the beginning of independence and why we set the original government, the first Constitution, Articles of Confederation, up as we did. From there, what went wrong? What happened to make us decide that the Articles were not working? I'm going to insert this second discussion about the kind of underlying thinking of the founders in terms of their ideas about human nature, optimism, pessimism, and their ideas about the types of government that work or what was likely to happen with them. And those ideas are going to come from Locke and Hobbes. And then finally, all of that is going to feed into why we set the Constitution up as we did. And I'm just going to touch on this, and we'll pick this up in class. All right, let's start with initial attitudes. At the time of independence and into the 1780s, the Declaration of Independence infuses or unleashes a burst of confidence and inspiration among the colonists, now independent Americans. They're excited to be free from Britain. They are excited to be ruling themselves, kind of like somebody, a young adult who moves out on their own for the first time and just is soaking in that, being in charge of yourself. But more than that, they feel that what they're embarking upon is something nobody's ever tried before. They are going to try to self-govern a very large country with no king or queen. Actually, in some ways, kind of 13 countries. There had been small democracies before, the city-states of Greece. Switzerland had some city-state democracies, but over a vast area and a large people, nobody had really tried democracy before. And so those two things make the newly independent Americans feel like they are embarked on something really important, and they have a lot of momentum and confidence. Having just broken away from a king, they especially don't want a strong government controlling them. So they set up 13 individual governments held together by a weak or loose confederation. That's the Articles of Confederation. um, you should understand how it's weak by design or on purpose. And some of this was in the reading. Um, it's got two main weaknesses. One is that it's only a legislative branch. They can pass laws, but lacking an executive branch and a court system, they don't really have a way to make those laws happen, to enforce them, unless everybody kind of voluntarily agrees to follow them. Um, the no executive branch means no military power, and without that threat of force, things are much weaker. Without a court system to settle disputes, say between states, again, um, the Congress, which is set up, that's the legislative piece, under the Articles of Confederation, is especially weak. The second weakness is that the Articles of Confederation Congress has no money. How do governments get money? By taxing. And the states were able to tax and were jealous of that power and did not want to share it with the Congress. So all that the Congress could do was ask for money from the states, and they sent some, but not very much, and Congress was inevitably short of money. A third weakness, but not as big a one, is that rather than having a simple majority of 7 out of 13, they made it hard to get anything passed, so it had to be 9 out of 13 votes. This makes it too weak. Can't get anything done. The only real achievement that the Articles of Confederation Congress is able to accomplish is that we owned the area to the west of the Appalachian Mountains called the Northwest Territories, the Ohio, Michigan area. And the Congress does settle upon a plan to settle that area, set up a process for how those territories could become states. And that law, the Northwest Ordinance, is actually going to be one of the more important laws in American history. So that's a significant achievement, and we'll talk about that in another unit. But that's really the only thing they get done. A lot of problems. As you remember from the reading, they couldn't pay their debts to foreign countries. They couldn't even fully pay their soldiers, and the soldiers threatened a coup. That's another example where George Washington kind of steps in and provides leadership that looks beyond the interests of himself or his own group. And he was very concerned that the military be subordinate to the civilian government. And it is very believable that he could have led his officers and soldiers in a coup and taken over the government. But he alone kind of stood against the military people who wanted to do that and said, no, we're not going to do that. And then the biggest problem is when Shays' Rebellion occurred, the government was unequipped to deal with it. Let's talk about Shays' Rebellion. It takes place 1786, 1787, kind of the winter months from, say, October through February or March in western Massachusetts. The Revolutionary War ends in 1783, and we are cut off from trade with Britain, and there is an economic depression. Farmers struggle, they're in debt, and because the price of their goods is declined because of the depression, they can't pay their taxes and they can't pay off their farms. So they are losing their farms. The banks that they owed money to were going to court and foreclosing on the farms and taking them away. What the farmers want is paper money. They want more money printed, which will cause inflation, and that will raise the price of the farm goods, they hope, and make it easier for them to pay off their debts, because the debts will stay the same amount, but the price of the farm products will rise. And this becomes a battle between the rural areas of western Massachusetts, Springfield, and the Berkshires and Central Valley, and the city elites of Boston, the merchants and the bankers who were owed money, because the farmers want paper currency, but the bankers and the merchants want a hard currency. They don't want inflation because that will erode the value of what they're owed, and so this is the battle. Uh, Captain Daniel Shays is a Revolutionary War veteran, and he leads the soldiers in a little bit of a ragtag rebellion, but they gather up arms and they begin to attack the courts and prevent the courts from um, hearing the bankruptcy cases and shutting down the foreclosure. Um, from the point of view of the rebels, they think they are simply continuing what was done during the American Revolution, that they're being unfairly taxed and the rich and powerful who don't understand them are in their way. And so they see themselves as uh, patriots in the way that the revolutionaries during the American Revolution saw themselves as patriots. And in fact, many of them are the same exact people. They were soldiers in the Revolutionary War who were still owed money. And so they definitely had a legitimate perspective. The response is it's hard to put it down because Congress is pretty worthless. They have no army and they have no money. Um, and so the um, rebels do pretty well for a while. Finally, the wealthy banking elite of Boston raised the money for a private militia themselves and put down the rebels. But and that ends Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is not significant because of what happened. It's significant because of the reaction to it. It demonstrates the weakness of the government of the Articles of Confederation. And so it's going to shift the thinking towards we need a stronger central government. Um, but really, there are two reactions. There's the reaction I just talked about, and there is Thomas Jefferson's reaction, and the reaction of those who really don't think it's such a bad thing. He says something like, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. It keeps the leaders attentive and brings about needed change. Whereas many of the people who are going to write the Constitution, the educated and powerful elites of the 13 states, take a darker view of the rebellion. And Washington is a good example of those people. He says we are fast verging on anarchy. So this kind of sets up the dilemma that faces those who are going to write the Constitution. On the one hand, they want a government that is strong enough to prevent anarchy, and Shays' Rebellion kind of pushes that group forward. But on the other hand, they don't want a government that is too strong, and that dilemma is going to be fundamental to the way the Constitution is written. So make sure you understand that point. So, what have we covered so far? These three things. We've covered what were our initial attitudes, why did we set the government as it was, and what happened to make us decide the Articles of Confederation was not working. We're 15 minutes in. I'm going to get to really the heart of this lecture now, which is the thinking underlying the actions that the people who wrote the Constitution had. Before I get to that, though, let me just share with you the actual letters from which these comments were taken. Nope. I'm going to talk about Hobbes and Locke, sorry. there are kind of two ways of thinking about human nature and about governments that were dominant in the 16 and 1700s. Both stem from two English thinkers from the 1600s. The first is John Locke's way of thinking, and he has a much more hopeful view of human nature and governments. Um, it is really his type of thinking that is the basis for the Declaration of Independence. So his ideas are that basically people can basically be trusted. Um, and he is writing during England's civil wars in the 1600s when the king and parliament are fighting, and it goes on for several decades over the divine right of kings and things like that. And Locke argues that there is no such thing as a divine right, that governments stem from the people, that rulers rule by consent of the governed. And if you didn't have a government, you would have anarchy. So you've got to have a government, but their whole purpose is to protect the things that Jefferson talked about in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So Locke's whole thing is going to be you need to incorporate some democratic things into a government. You need to listen to the people. And even more importantly, you need to make sure a government isn't too powerful so that it can tyrannize or dominate the people. Big influence on Thomas Jefferson, and you'll see that as I continue the lecture. Thomas Hobbes is the other important thinker of the 1600s from Britain, and he has a much darker, more cynical view of humans and about power. He thinks that basically all men are essentially wicked, and life is, as he put it, nasty, brutish, and short. He said if you put the people in charge, they'll turn into a mob. If you have a group in charge, they will abuse their power, and most kings or monarchs will abuse their power as well. But the best thing you can do is have a government that is strong enough to control the people. Washington has much more of a Thomas Hobbes type view, and so does Alexander Hamilton. Here's some letters. I'm going to try to not go through them in detail, but I'm going to post them. And you should be able to read through these letters and understand how they have either a Hobbesian view or a Lockean view, and what they mean, and their reaction to Shays' Rebellion and their thoughts about what kind of government we need. So there are two letters from Washington. One is at the beginning of Shays' Rebellion, November 1786. It's Washington to Madison. No more never dawned more favorable than ours did. He's talking about 1776 and the beginning of the country, and no day was ever more clouded than the present. So you see that initial optimism now clouded by pessimism. Without some alteration in our political creed, the superstructure we have been 7 years raising at the expense of much blood and treasure must fall. We are fast verging to anarchy and confusion. So he's arguing there they need a stronger government. How melancholy is the reflection that in so short a space we should have made such large strides towards fulfilling the prediction of our transatlantic foe, meaning, this is a quote of someone from England, leave them to themselves and their government will soon dissolve. If there exists not a power to check them, what security has a man of life, liberty, and property? And when he talks about these disorders, he's talking about Shays' Rebellion. 13 sovereignties pulling against each other and all tugging at the federal head will soon bring ruin on the whole. See, that's a very dark, pessimistic view. This one is similar. He's writing a month later to Henry Knox, Good God, who besides a Tory could have foreseen or Britain predicted them? Notwithstanding the boasted virtue of America, we are far gone in everything ignoble and bad. Then you go to Jefferson. It's a much longer letter. It's going to go over 2 slides. Writing in January of the new year, he says, and Jefferson is actually in France. He is the representative of the 13 states to the government in Paris. And so he's writing to Madison saying, I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about what's going on in the eastern states. And by that he means Massachusetts. So far as I have yet seen, they do not appear to threaten serious consequences. Those states have suffered by, he's talking about the Depression, and made money scarce and the people uneasy. This uneasiness has produced acts absolutely unjustifiable, but I hope they will provoke no severities from the governments. He's saying societies exist under 3 forms. With no government, as among our Indians, which is not actually true, but it's his perspective. Under governments where the will of the people has a just influence, meaning the people have some say in the government, as is the case in England, in a slight degree, and ours in a great one. So he likes the Articles of Confederation government. And under governments of force, as is the case in all other monarchies. He's talking about the third one now, government of force. He's saying it's a government of wolves over sheep. And he's talking about in a government of the second type where the people have some influence, man enjoys a precious degree of liberty and happiness. It has its evils too, the principle of which is the turbulence to which it is subject. So when you let the people have some say, things can be more topsy-turvy because they're impulsive. But weigh this against the oppressions of monarchy and it becomes nothing. There's a very famous Latin saying which translates as, I prefer a dangerous freedom over a peaceful slavery. And that is a good summary of Jefferson's views. And then this is the famous quote, I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and is necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. Unsuccessful rebellions, indeed, generally establish the encroachments on the rights of the people which have produced them. So he's saying when the people push back with a rebellion, it's what keeps the government from controlling them too much and keeping them in check. Underlying those Hobbesian and Lockean attitudes is an idea from Greek and Roman history that are kind of classical history that Washington and Jefferson and Hamilton would have all been familiar with. And they would have thought that there was an endless cycle of government where it went from rule by one that would eventually become corrupt and the nobles or aristocrats would rise up, say the Roman Senate, and take power from the Caesar. And then the Senate would become corrupt and the people would rise up and take power, and then they would degenerate into a mob, and you would cycle back to a strong dictator would take power. It is the pattern that is observed just a few years after this in the 1790s with the French Revolution, where the nobles rise up against the corrupt king with the tennis court oath, and you then have the people rise up under the Reign of Terror and Robespierre, and it does turn into a bloodbath and mob rule, and then the strong man, the rule by one, comes back forward with Napoleon. So underlying that is a kind of mostly Hobbesian view that eventually all governments degenerate. So when you have rule by one, the positive is there's no anarchy, it's order. But the negative is inevitably that dictatorship will degenerate into tyranny. It might take one generation or two or three, but it happens eventually. And then the few will rise up, and their strength is that they're wiser and less impulsive, especially than the people. But eventually they'll become corrupt too, and the people will rise up. The Lockean piece is that when the people rise up, you get that democratic impulse and looking after the needs of the people. The negative is they're impulsive and they're passionate and they're not as wise as the aristocrats, and so you degenerate into mob rule and tyranny of the majority. And a lot of people felt with the Articles of Confederation that we had gone too far to that side. So if you're pessimistic, like Washington was, you're faced with this idea that, man, all three of these types of governments suck. Each is vulnerable to corruption. Each is vulnerable to abuse of power. What are you going to do? And so, with a very pessimistic view, they thought, well, can we create a government that has pieces of all three? That's a really important concept. So that each can kind of check the other, and we don't have to go through this endless cycle. And so that's what they're going to do. They're going to try to have a little bit of a rule by one, a little bit of a rule by the few, and a little bit of a rule by the many, all jumbled together in a mishmash in the Constitution. And they're going to hope that they prevent that degeneration into tyranny by any one of them, tyranny of the majority or dictatorship, or by the oligarchy. So you put that all together, and that's why you get the Constitution we have. You have a little bit of Locke in there. We read last week about we the people. And so there's this motivation to give the people some say. But for the most part, the Constitution is darker. The Articles of Confederation and the Declaration of Independence are Locke's, when Locke was kind of at his most influential. But because of Shays' Rebellion, that darker, more pessimistic side comes out, and the Constitution is fundamentally a document based on a pessimistic view of human nature. They think all forms of government are imperfect, and so they try to combine them, like I said in the last slide, to prevent that inevitable degeneration. And so you get the mix of all three. In class, we'll try to pull out where that mix is. Like, where's the rule by one? Where's the rule by many? Where's the rule by the few? And for the test, you should be able to do that. But what this lecture hopefully establishes is why we went with those things. In the end, the Constitution is going to be try to balance two things: a government that is not too powerful, because the people who wrote it still remember the colonial era when they felt they were under the thumb of the king and a government that was too much powerful. But they also wanted a government that wasn't too weak. The Articles of Confederation and the anarchy of the Shays' Rebellion era. So you end up with something that is tries to give them some power, but not too much. When you go back, I know I'm at 29 minutes, but this was actually a much better lecture. So you go back to those initial questions, and instead of just clicking this off and putting away your notes, you should make sure when you come in to class that you can answer each of these just from your own understanding, not by memorizing stuff. And I think you'll be in good shape then. All right, I'm going to shut this off now. Nice work. See you in class.